The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 educators in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with standards set by the Tennessee Department of Education. For more professional development videos, check out our website at cem.mtsu.edu.
Introductions. I am Andy Polk. My fancy name is Dr. Andrew Polk. I'm an assistant professor here. Two things that fit for this class. I was a former high school teacher for years, and I am officially the director of history education or something here. So I take all students through history education program. I also do some of the kind of CAPE certification stuff for the university and a few other things. My research field is U.S. religion and politics. I do identity politics, specifically kind of modern U.S. Religious history in general, but especially where religion, politics, race, and gender all come together. I'm a lot of fun at parties. It's one of those great things, you know, people introduce themselves and, oh, what do you do? I teach at MTSU, and usually that's just like, oh, okay, and then we talk about something else. Some people follow up with, oh, well, what do you study? And then all conversations cease. This is the glorious thing. I do religion and politics. No, I'm not going to talk to you about anything. I find it fascinating. We may do another one next year as we host this with teaching religion. I know that can be difficult in today's age, politically, but also of how we broach those things. Today, this specifically is a pedagogy session. We're going to talk about historical memory. But we're going to use one lesson that I just love to introduce this, and near the end of it, I'll tell you the ways that I do this with a few others. So part of the ways to broach this, in addition to doing religion and politics, because you see we're going to deal with this because you can't deal with this issue without dealing with religion also, in the way that people at the time conceived of gender and reconceived it during this time period, and the way they understood race and their place within it. But one thing that I think is essential in this, I'm a professional historian that thinks historical trivia is generally worthless for all of humanity. I don't think it's terribly helpful. It is in terms of the way we construct the past, but most people don't care that much about the past. They use the past, right? We tell stories of the past to give meaning to the present. So it's helpful in that we're entitled to our own opinions, but not our own fact and not our own reality, right? So we have to base those stories on fact. But I think more of what we do is use history, again, especially with the subjects that I do, because it removes part of our understanding, right? We can talk about something that happened in the past because those people are dead, and even though right now, if we talked about that same subject, I would fight you immediately. But back then, maybe I can think about it, right? I can critically analyze, I can compare. But one of the ways that steps even beyond that, so critical analysis of primary and secondary documents, of the way we formulate, the way we build history, is the fact of historical memory. Again, people use history to tell stories of the past to give meaning to the present. It turns out some of the stories that we know, and all of you wrestle with this often, and I've been in your shoes for a while, especially with teenagers who are just giant balls of hormones, and generally parroting things around them and thinking that they are rebelling against things around them in the exact same way, and it's this wonderful flush. It turns out some of the stories we know, aren't fully accurate. But the question is not that glorious, right, history nerd thing of actually, right, we know this is not the way we begin anything. Actually, that's not what happened. Right? The question beyond that is, well, why? Right? Why is that story isn't accurate? Why is that the story? Because people use the story, right? So this is the understanding of historical memory. Not just, that's another side we'll talk about a little bit at the end, the fact that our memories are questionable, right? The way we remember things is subjective. That's part of it, but also when a story that is just a story, not the story, becomes popular, becomes a narrative, even a national narrative, that means that story does something, All right, so we're going to talk about one of those stories today, and this is Sojourner truth. So what I have there for you on the handout, we will do some things today. I understand you are Honors AP. Some of you may know all this stuff beforehand. But I want us to walk through this process a little bit in terms of what we know, what we don't know, and how we understand these. What I have for you at the beginning, we won't go through all of this. Generally, when I do my classes here, I don't use full PowerPoint just because it messes with my groove. In my classes, I use History Lab, so I never lecture the entire time. But it is good to have some content at the beginning. But students like some note-taking guide, and I don't like to spell things constantly. Right, that glory you're going through, and you know what's coming up. Can you spell? And you have to stop and spell, and it's problematic. So I give them handouts beforehand and say, if the name's not on there, you don't need to know it. And so they do it through there. This is the outline that I usually use in my U.S. Survey classes. I teach, last semester I taught U.S. Religious Experience. I'll teach U.S. Religion and Politics in the fall, and then Race and Religion in the American South in the spring. So on those upper level ones, once co-done with graduate students, it's a different level, but this is my survey class. So very briefly, it's very brief, and we'll have questions at the end. If you want me to fill in some gaps, I can. This is how I set up this lesson, right? Because they need context to be able to work through these things. We've already done a context before this class over the creation of race in America. That's a long history. It's complicated. We've been through the early colonial period of indentured servitude, of why the African slave trade wasn't terribly popular in the North American colonies, and then how and why that started to change over. But the key to that of understanding that I find with my students is for them to understand race as a creation, and that's part of it that I now have to re-explain today. Race is a, right? It is not based on biology, any of that stuff. It's a creation. It's a creation during the colonial period, and it's inherently hierarchical, right? Often when students today think of race, they think, well, there's different skin color, and that's differences usually like physically mostly, right? And they have underlying that all of those racial legacies of because you're this race, you have a certain personality. You're more inclined to things. Right? That is the original forefront of race. It is levels of humanity, right? That literally you become fully human on different levels. And at the top of that hierarchy, sometimes it was 5, sometimes it was 6. The top of that level is what we now call Caucasian. That's actually somewhat anachronistic in the creation. But right, white is the full elevation of humanity, the full possibility. At the bottom of that is African, in which they have the lowest ability to fully be human. So that becomes essential for what truth does in that creation. All right, so that's the backstory. But into that story of the understanding of the creation of race is gender. Now this again, right, it becomes controversial. So what I always do with students at the beginning is say, you may fully feel that there is some type of inherent, right, fancy term, ontological gender identity within people, that men are like this and women are like this. That's fine. You can believe that. I'm not trying to take that away. But what we have to acknowledge is that the way we understand that is at least partially culturally created by the fact that those understandings have changed over time, right? When we say women are like this and men are like this, what the like this is has changed in different periods, right? So at least partially, gender is created in an understanding. One of those created time periods here is in the mid to moving into full realization is late 19th century. But we're talking about 1830s, 1840s, and especially 1850s. A change happened in America that was economic, but it had massive implications on the way people understood the way women are and men are. So you can kind of guess through the framework that I give you there of what's going on here. But the key of this, as I start out, is this understanding of the Hebrew creation myths. And myth doesn't mean false story. Myth means story of origins, right? That's just doesn't matter in terms of your religious persuasion, right? The way that especially the Hebrew creation story, the second one of Adam and Eve, right? The creation of humanity as a whole. The way it was understood in Western cultures for a long time, we don't have time to go through the way I stepped them a little bit. The main element is, right, Adam and Eve are created. Adam is created first from the dust of the ground, Adam. God breathes life into Adam. Adam becomes alive. All the other creation is brought before Adam. None of them fit Adam. He can name them, but they don't complete with him. So God puts Adam to sleep, takes a part of him, a part of man becomes woman, and they are perfectly met for each other. All is well in the Garden of Eden. And then the serpent, right? So later Christian mythology understands this is to be Satan. That's not in the original story. This is a talking serpent. A wily serpent comes along, tells Eve, God has lied to you. God said, do whatever you want, but don't eat of two trees, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. If you eat of them, you'll surely die. The serpent says, lying to you. Now, the way that story was told, the facts were all the same. The way it was told until this time period, moving into the 19th century in Western cultures was, well, Eve came up, and sure enough, the serpent waited until Adam was far off and waited until he got Eve alone, because that's just how Eve is, right? So the serpent came and tempted Eve and convinced Eve and said, no, you don't lie. You'll have something more. You'll be like unto God. And that was tempting to Eve. And so she ate of that fruit. And then what'd she do? She turned around. She went to her husband. The serpent didn't tempt Adam. Eve tempted Adam. She led him into sin. And poor Adam, he just loved his wife. And she told him, she convinced him, she moved through. He ate of the fruit. Their eyes were opened. And then we get sin and the fall of humanity. That was the story in which Eve is a temptress, a seductress, right? This in constant gender understanding in Europe and the West at the time, women, you got to be careful of the men. It was always men speaking to men because they lure you into things. You got to isolate them. They got to be there. There's things they can take care of, but they can't do any more because they can't be trusted. That was the story. At this time period, that story changed. Same fact, same narrative. But the way it was told changed. The way it was told was this, right? That Adam goes off, the serpent waits until Eve is there, but the reason is different. The reason is because Eve is just so naive. Eve doesn't know any better, right? We all know this, right? Women are just more moral, or more honorable. Women are so nurturing. Men, we're not, I didn't give me a baby. I don't know what to do with it. But women, just immediately you're caring and you're nurturing, you go through and you're pure and you're innocent, but also naive. And so Eve was naive and she believed the serpent and she came through and then she went to her husband and that story stays the same. Poor Adam, he just loved his wife. It's never man's fault. But Eve came and convinced him, and he believed his wife, and he ate of the fruit and downfall of humanity. Right? Now, the link of this is an economic change, right? There's no dark, smoky rooms of this stuff where people just get together in the Illuminati and figure out how shall we change the story of people. It doesn't happen. People just can't work that way. What happens as we understand this is those tellings usually are explanations afterwards, right? This is a new world, but how does it fit? What do we do? And so we retell a story to make the world that we are living in make more sense. And the change that was happening at this time was an economic change. Beforehand, the Western world, almost everyone was agrarian, right? Going to work was going outside. Right? Everyone lived in a farmhouse, founding of the Republic, and where 90% of Americans were farmers. By the time you get to the mid-19th century, that's changing. Still a whole lot of farmers around. For the most part, men and women worked and lived in the exact same place, mostly on farms. If not, they were artisans. But where was their shop? In front of or downstairs, right? Going to work was going usually between a parted curtain out to the front of the same building, or they walked downstairs if they were really high class. Live and work in the same place. There was men's work and women's work, but they worked always together. There was always joined. Now, 19th century, it's not Industrial Revolution yet. This really sets in, but you have the beginning of manufacturing. And again, we don't have time to walk through it as much as I do with them, but part of this happens with a change in technology, of transportation, and of economics, in which what happens more and more and more is men are now going off to work. Right? And not even the day that we say it now, right? We're at our home, you go off to work, and then you come back, right, at 3, 4, sometimes 8, 9 at night, right? At this point, a lot of times when they would start to, especially what we would then call middle class and upper class, who had the power, who usually told these narratives, the men would go into the city and they would stay there for the work week, and then they would come back home. All of a sudden, women were at home with the kids, men were off It worked. What happened in this understanding of change is what we now refer to as a re-understanding of chivalry. Right? How does this work? When women are there by themselves, they're taking care of the kids, they're in the home, and men are off. And you know, this was part of that invention. Men gonna be men, right? Men are out, and they're gonna do things, right? This understanding of sexual mores, right? That men are somehow more, and you can't really blame them because they're just men. That actually wasn't a Western story for a long time. That understanding, that duality. But now, and the application of this became what we understand as the cult of domesticity, or the cult of true womanhood, in which we create separate spheres. Women are at home, and they're going to cook, and they're going to clean, and they're going to take care of the children. Not because it's any type of oppression, not even because it's economics, because that was God's original intent. Because women are innocent. They're the best of us. You're moral and you're pure, but you can't handle the vagaries of the world. Think of Eve. It's too tempting, too bad for you, right? You just get it's too much. So you got to stay where it's innocent as pure, and you take care of the children, and the men will handle all those vagaries, all that rough stuff, because men can handle it. Just let us deal with it, and we'll go off. And you can't blame us. Men are going to be men. But we know how to do this because there's different standards, right? Because in the end, men are going to go off and women are going to stay home. But why? How does that work out? What is this world? Turns out it was always there from the very beginning. Now, all of this starts to get messed up, right, in this movement. Part of this is what we call the fancy term, the Second Great Awakening, right? This is basically when the South became the Bible Belt. The South beforehand, at the founding of the Republic, was almost totally irreligious. America as a whole almost was. Our best number is about 17% of Americans at the time of the founding went to church once a month, right? That's relatively new invention, has come up and maybe plateaued since 90s. But that's the story of American religion, irreligious to more religious. At this point, the South was totally irreligious. The Methodists and the Presbyterians come in. The Baptists start forming through. You have some native churches coming up. The Churches of Christ come about at this time. The Mormon Church comes about at this time. And part of this, in this work, in the new way they did it, authority didn't come from your Master of Divinity from Yale or Harvard. It came from your ability to preach the word, right? You come out if you can sway the masses. It's no creed but the Bible. This was the part of what we now call evangelical churches. And if you could come and you can convince the people, and there's the turn of this called Arminianism, where you choose God. God laid it all out there and choose Jesus, your personal Lord and Savior. That's also a theological understanding that took hold at this point, and it fit with the American frontier. And if you could do that, if you could convince people to come forward, you had spiritual power. The issue is in that movement that becomes a little more egalitarian than people think. It turns out if women, who are often encouraged to do this, because they were always the majority of participants. So what happens is you emphasize prayer, and you emphasize confession, and you emphasize singing. And you allow women to do that, right? But it turns out if women are speaking and taking their confession, some women, you may have experienced this in your lives, when people come up and so they're going to say a prayer, that prayer lasts 30 minutes. Turns out that prayer sounds an awful lot like a sermon. It's not a new thing. And it turns out some women had authority and power because they were more charismatic than their men. In all of this, that intricately gets tied together with Sojourner truth. I promise we're getting into historical memory in a second, because this is the intense background. So Sojourner truth that you have there, we'll go through briefly. She was born a slave in upstate New York. English was actually her second language. She only spoke Dutch until she was 9. She grew up. She had a romantic relationship early on with a male slave from a adjoining plantation. That was perfectly fine for generally for her master. It was not fine for the male slave's master, because most laws at this time, if 2 slaves had children, the mother's owner owned those children. Because this is the point of intergenerational chattel slavery. This was the revolution, in part, that took hold. That I not only own you, I own all of your progeny. But who then owns? The mothers. So the owner of the man that she was in relationship with in all the worlds was her boyfriend, her lover, would have become married, beat him literally to an inch of his life. Possibly her first, second child were from that individual. In all likelihood, her second child with her master. She eventually married another man who was on her plantation. He was an older slave there. She had 5 children. New York, towards the end, went like many of the northern states and started to go towards abolition. And they did this much as we do now today when we're saying there's going to be a big change. We don't say the change is now. We say pass a law. In a year, it's going to take effect. And that's what they did. But they had to have some way for all slave owners in New York not to just sell all their slaves down. So they passed it and they said at this date, you have to release them in a year, but you can't sell them during that time period. Sojourner Truth, she took her daughter, her eldest daughter, she essentially ran away because she was told over and over from her master, I'm going to free you, I'm going to free you, I'm going to free you. He never did. She left, she went with a family who was living in town. They eventually negotiated that the master would rent her out to that person until the time of freedom. Meanwhile, her other children were there on the plantation. One of her sons was sold down to Louisiana. It's against the law during the period. Sojourner Truth took her former master to court and won her son's freedom. As far as we can tell, the first African-American woman to ever win a court case against a former master, and it was for the freedom of her son. She was free. She became converted to Christianity. That's kind of complicated through some Mennonite influence, and then through the Methodists. There was a prophet, Matthias, from kind of the broad evangelical tradition. She became associated with, went on speaking tours through this. She was incredibly intelligent, incredibly persuasive. And it's through that process that we get to 1851. There was a women's rights convention that was going on in Akron, Ohio. So the home of LeBron James and this. And that's all I know about Akron, Ohio. In which she came up, as the story was told, she was not invited to speak. She had published a book, publishing that was mostly self-publication at the time. She'd go around the speaking tours. She would sell her books. That's how she'd make a living and go through. So she basically invited herself. You can come through. She came, and one of the stories is told, she sat basically on the stage next to where the person was speaking would and just sat there. It was much more open at this point. That wasn't terribly unusual. But eventually, people came and talked to her and asked her what she was about, what she was doing. They were incredibly impressed by her and asked her to come speak. And the speech she gave became one of the more famous speeches in American history, Ain't I a Woman? Right? How many of you have Ain't I a Woman in your curriculum? Right? It's pretty common, right? It used to be standard in American lit textbooks, right? It would sometimes be coordinated with American history. In American lit textbook, always you would be reading Ain't I a Woman? Right? So what you have on the back of that page are the 2 extant versions of this speech. Now again, some of you already know this. There are 2 versions. What happened with this? If so, play along, right? This is how we walk through in our understanding of historical memory. Now go ahead and tell you these 2 versions of the speech. There were 2 newspaper references to this right after she gave the speech. They didn't actually say what she said. They were like brief kind of synopses. A woman came up and she talked about equality and went through, and it was so awesome, and that's kind of all we have. One of these was published within a month. So it was, I think, May 24th, 1851 that she gave the speech. June 21st, one of these was published by the recording secretary at the convention. The other one was published 12 years later, in May of 1863, by someone who also was at the convention, but published this, obviously, 1863 during the Civil War in an abolitionist newspaper. Now, I'm not yet going to tell you which is which one. Now, I want us to do, for a little bit, if you look on the next page, I have 2 sets of questions. Right, so this is what I do. We're honors AP. We only have so much time, right? But I want you to read those 2 speeches, and then I want you, as best you can, use shorthand, right? Answer these questions. Now, the way I would do this in class, the way I like to do it, So we would walk through, they would answer the questions, usually individually. I would have them in groups and tables just like this. I like groups of 4. They would then talk about their answers, right? Agree, disagree, where we are, and then we talk about it together. For the sake of time, we're going to skip that middle step, right? And I'm sorry to make you work today. But read these 2 speeches, 2 versions of the same speech, and then do these questions. As you'll see, they're asking 2 different things. The questions A, the A set, is about the fact that there are 2 speeches here. What are the differences? Does that change anything? If it is intentional, I'll go ahead and tell you on that 3rd question, there are changes to one, and they were intentional. Right? So if so, who do you think was the intended audience, right? This is part of that understanding through. And then you'll see questions B are just about, okay, let's kind of combine these speeches. They're both based on the same speech. So what is Truth saying? What's her argument? What does it go through there? So if you don't mind, take the next 5-10 minutes or so, read these speeches, the versions of the speech, and then fill out these questions basically, and then we're going to walk through not just the answers, but why am I asking them this way? What does this have to do with historical memory? All right, go to it. All right, so let's get crazy. Let's start with question 1 on A. All right, walk the razor's edge. So let's do this. So what are some differences that you see? Somebody give me one difference that you saw through these. It can be stylistic, it can be content. Which one?
2 sounds scripted.
Okay, so 2 sounds scripted to you? Okay.
Summarization or analysis.
Okay, analysis, summarization for 2.
Well, the dialect of number 1 was probably a little bit more of the rural, uneducated slave speaking out.
Yeah, the dialect seems to make sense, right? So this is a vernacular in the first. Seems so, right? Seems more oral. Yeah, more polished in the second one.
More repetition in the first.
More repetition. The repetition specifically of what? Ain't I a woman? You notice version 2, that phrase does not exist. Ain't I a woman isn't in version 2. It is in version 1, right? That repetition, that coming. What else? What are some other changes?
Version 2 talks more about the Bible.
Okay. More religion in version 2, right? So you still have the woman mess it up, let woman fix it, right? That's in both, but you get Lazarus, you get Mary and Martha. You have more religious content. I think so in the second one than the first. What else?
Version 1 has interaction with the audience.
Yeah, right? So there's this question, what was it, that thing in the head they called, right? So something of an interaction with the audience. That's a good way to put it.
To me, it seemed more persuasive.
More persuasive. This happens a lot. Why so? What do you think?
Because of her interaction, I think.
Yeah, right? It seems more oral, seems more emotive, right? That you're coming through, it seems like you're kind of picked up on the flow. I think it's more stylistic, more rhetorical. The other one, right, the explanation, I think y'all said, that it seems like it's kind of more in a written form, perhaps. Anything else? A few other content things that are different here.
Well, the first to me was more of a personal experience.
Okay. More personal in the first one? Yeah, I could get that. Why do you think more personal?
Well, she just referred to herself.
Yeah, refers to herself more.
It seems to be more of a believable account of someone who had suffered through slavery than the second version, which was just maybe trying to persuade you.
Yeah, more persuaded, more cleaned up. What was it? There's an addition in the first one that's not in the second of these kind of what would be the ain't I a woman refrain, right? They say this, but I could do this as a man. I know what's... Yeah, so this bore 13 children, seen most sold off into slavery. It's once, children aren't mentioned, right? So may come to a personal thing in the second one. Oh, what else? One thing she adds there is, and bear the lash as well. Right? There's more in some sense specifically about slavery, or the fact that she's not just a woman, that she's a black woman in the first and in the second. Right? That comes. So what, if anything, you kind of answered it a little bit. This is where we come from question 2. Did anything change? What do you think stylistically? Does it change the content, the message between versions 1 and 2? What do you think about that?
Version 2 seemed to almost be asking permission.
Okay.
Version 1 was like, no, this is going to happen.
Yeah. Right? Version 1, it's not just more persuasive, it seems more demanding, right? This is, I'm telling you what is. Version 2 seems to be like, well, why not? Right? Okay.
Number 1 has a personal conviction where she says, ain't got nothing more to say. She's finished, she said it.
That's it, appreciate it. Nothing more to say.
Seems like version 2 could keep going on and on and on and on.
Version 1 seems to be a call to action.
Okay.
Version 2 is just kind of a here's how I feel about this situation.
Okay. Yeah, that it is asking permission, it's laying out a situation, and we can change this. Yeah, something more specific, more powerful, right, in version 1 that comes along. All right, so what about question 3, right? So assuming, which you can, I told you, right, that the change, right, one right after, one 12 years later, that the changes were intentional. Who do you think the audience is for version 1 and version 2? What about version 1? Who do you think the audience seems to be there? You're guessing. Women? Okay. Anything else? Common woman? Abolitionists, did you say? Okay. Fiery? Right, so poor uneducated whites, African Americans, right? If this seems more common. What about version 2 then? Who do you think the audience is there? Christians, because more religious content perhaps? Abolitionists. Magazines? What? Well-to-do. Right? It seems written, right? That this is more convincing an audience, right? But it's in written form. Maybe those, magazines, right? Who are upper crust society coming through here. All right, I sense that one of my other shticks is, I don't know, I decided this randomly. I'm a weird guy. But one of the things is like, this is still America. In America, we raise our hands. I don't know why raising of hands would be American, but I made it up randomly with too much sugar like 4 years ago, and students like it. So I always do a thing of like, because I do these things, what do you think? Like, raise your hand, and like, not the Canadian way with a bent elbow. It makes no sense. And I try to, if we have a lot of exchange students, so I try to find like ways of like, not the whatever, Brazilian way. And then we're like, what? And then we get a whole thing. Right, so how many of you think one is a month afterwards, one's 12 years afterwards? How many of you think version 1 was the one that was from a month afterwards, right after? We are recording this, but this won't be documented for all posterity. If you're wrong, it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant, right? How many of you think version 2 was the one that was right after? Okay, there's some disagreement there as it comes through. All right, so let's put a pin on that. We'll come back to it. All right, so there are differences. The differences matter, changing in style, tone, what's going on. So let's look at content as a whole. Questions B. All right, so how does Sojourner Truth respond to the characterization of women as weak and in need of male protection and chivalric attention, right? So this would be going to that content section that would lead up to it, right? These gender understandings, right? Women, and this is part of the thing, right? So this, the chivalric attention we get into. The way you see this, it's not generally this way now, right? If you open the door for someone and then you just become the door holder for like 7.5 minutes so you can make a squat. That's just kind of the way it is now. As a general rule, and I'm not stepping any toes we go through here, the way you see this in terms of the gender dynamics of true gentlemen do these things for women, which is what she's commenting on, the way you see that those are at least partially tied to power dynamics is that in that old model, if I as a man am supposed to open the door for a woman, in that same model, people who generally feel that must be done for gentlemen with ladies. If a man, I were to come up and, and open the door for another man, that man thought the same way, would be insulted that I would do that for him. Right? That becomes, right, whoa, not a woman, right? Which shows, right, but if I'm saying what I'm saying is that I am putting you on a pedestal, and it's not me over you, it's you above me, well, that wouldn't be insulting, that would be, right? So this, in some sense, we have to admit there's a power dynamic in the gentleman-lady chivalric understanding. And Sojourner Truth comes hard at that. So how does she respond to that women are weak and in need of male protection and chivalric attention? How does she deal with that?
Very well.
Very well, okay, I would agree. How? What does she do? What strategies? I can do anything a man can do. Yeah, I can do anything a man can
work as hard, eat as much.
Yeah. Yeah, I love it. I can work as hard, I can harvest, I can chuck corn, I can eat as much if you'll give it to me, right?
She actually goes a step beyond and says, I've even done things a man can. I've given birth to children who are sold into slavery. So
that's right.
A man can't touch this.
And this becomes that refrain, right? This is where "and ain't I a woman" comes from, right? So you say men can do this, but I can do it. You say men can do this, but I can do that. If you let me. I can even seemingly do things men can't do, and ain't I a woman? Right? It becomes, in some sense, this is the issue with like these cultural rules that we come up with. It says that men are like this, women are like this, or even that, right? White people are like this, Black Americans are like this, and remember, because it's hierarchy. Race is hierarchy. It is what you are capable of doing, and her reaction to that is, what about me? Right? She's a living counterexample. If all that's true of who we are, if women are always less and men are always more, if a black woman especially is always less, but what about me? Ain't I a woman? Look at what I can do. She is a living counterexample to the rules. She breaks them of who she is, right? So that's powerful in itself, this argument. I shouldn't be who I am, but I am, so what does that say about your rules? Ain't I a woman? All right, number 2. How does she respond to the characterization of women as intellectually inferior? Follow-up, do you think women would agree with her argument? You, in fact, may be a woman. Do you agree with her argument? Why or why not? Right? What does she do with this? Right? Again, it's capability. It is not like, and this is the way it has kind of progressed in gender distinctions, right? That women are like more inclined and men are more inclined. That was not the setup and maybe not be the implications today. Men are above, women are below because of capabilities. What does she do with that? She deals with it directly with an illusion, she says.
We can't take more than our pint will hold?
That's right. So what is the setup, right? If this is true, what is the if in terms of intellect?
Men have a quart, women have a pint.
That's right. So this was the understanding today. If men, in terms of intelligence, their top intelligence can get up to a quart. Women, if they're the most intelligent, can only get to a pint. How many pints to a quart? 2. Right? That's the question. By the way, I totally look that up every year whenever I do this. Right? So by definition, if this is the way, and that's what it's saying, if woman is just really, you go to school and you get educated, top of it, what you could reach is half what a man's capability is. Right? So she's saying, if that's true, then what?
Well, she makes that argument that it has nothing to do with women's and the Negro rights. They should have it regardless of what it is. Doesn't she say that?
No. She doesn't seem to say, no, that's wrong. We should just be equal.
She says, let me have what I can have.
She says, yeah, if that's true, if a man can have a quart, a woman can only have a pint, then let me have my pint. There's no threat to you. Even if I fulfilled my entire potential, I'd still only be half of what you could be. Now, this is a thing, right, I'm going to get into, but I use this in illustration because this is always part of a choice that oppressed people have, right? Do I take the setup, right, the system that says, that puts me in a lower position, and do I play within that system? Do I use it to counteract, or do I say that system's junk? That's not true. I need it now. This was also what women, a lot of these women's conventions were going to in terms of suffrage, right? There was an intense debate over this. Should they, right, go and demand the vote, which is full equality, or should they just take baby steps? If you say, let me vote because I'm equal to you, and men say, whoa. Or do you just demand something little, something incremental? And then you go one step and you go one step. This was a debate. Sojourner Truth doesn't say, I'm equal to you. She says, if we have a quart and a pint, let us have our pint. It shouldn't, by your own standards, you shouldn't be worried about this. And then she has this religious turn of, if you say, Eve messed up the whole thing, let us try to put it right again. All right, what about 3? Do you think her race further challenges male dominance? Does she? How does race play into this? She's just not a woman, she's a black woman. This is intensely her experience. Does race matter in this? Yes? Why? How does she do this?
She's at the bottom of the hierarchy, and she's saying she's working as hard as a man, and saying that she takes the lashes the same.
That's right.
Doesn't need a man to help her over a puddle. She's had children.
Yeah.
What have you done?
Yeah, that's
like,
right.
I mean, she's
the
pushing
living
hard.
counterexample.
She pushes hard.
Yeah. Right, this, again, you have to remember, race was hierarchical, is a creation, right? It singles out what potential is. In the same way the quart and pint. That was always the way. And she says, why are you so afraid of me? Why does it matter? If you say I'm less than you, let me be the best I can be. And says, by your own standards, I shouldn't exist in the first place. Right? It's a living counterexample to the rules. She breaks them by being. All right, so this is the setup. This is the content, right? I mean, truth is just amazing in herself, right? It's a good, I think, combination of these, right, where all these issues come together. It focuses a time period together. But here's the issue. Version 2 was by a man named Marius Robinson. He's the one who published this in a publication called the Anti-Slavery Bugle. He published it on June 21st, 1851. He was the recording secretary of the convention. He was friends with Truth. Some stories, not sure if this is verified technically in the historiography, some historians say that it seems enough evidence to say that he actually shared this version with her, and she gave it the okay before he published it. At the very least, they had correspondence. Version 1 was published by a woman named Frances Gage, an abolitionist, in May of 1863. Now, here's the issue with this, of where this comes with historical memory. So part of it, I always like doing this because I give the background first, right? So what's part of the background that we talked about? So she was a slave. Where was she a slave? Upstate New York. She was bilingual. She didn't speak English until she was 9. She spoke Dutch before then. She was not a Southern slave, so of course would not have a Southern slave dialect. Right? And this is, you're like, oh, is that Southern? Look at that last line, right? You have to say that with a Southern accent. Obliged to you for hearing me, and now old Sojourner ain't got nothing more to say. This is a Southern slave dialect, and by all indication, Gage gave it to her. Right? She's born 13 children, seen them all, most all sold off into slavery. I told you, she's had 5 children. She had 1 sold off to slavery, and she got him back. Right? The second one has more religious content, right? She was converted and became a traveling preacher forever. This is how she even came to Akron, right? Published her story, came through. That language, version 2, is as close as we get to what she said. Here's the issue, though. It's not as, I agree with you, it's not as powerful, right? It is, it's asking, well, these things can't hold true, so, right, it's suggestive. Gage said, I like it, but it's not powerful enough, right? So she upped it. By all accounts, including those first 2 publications of what happened with Robinson, Sojourner Truth never said, ain't I a woman? Never came out of her mouth. Powerful. It sounds good, right? And it fits, right? It's to the movement of it, right? It fits with the content. It doesn't contradict. I mean, people, the other one, it's too clean cut, right? So what does Gage do? She gives her readers are going to expect, right? This is in the Civil War, 1863. So for abolitionism is a move in the Civil War when the body counts get up so high, both sides are saying, what is this? And you have to have a more explicit moral motivation. This is actually why in the North, the South issued declarations of succession. It was always about slavery. If you think that's controversial, read their declarations of succession. They said, this is why we're leaving. It was slavery. The North, it was about keeping the Union together in some weird milieu that came through, and there were the New York race riots because African Americans weren't drafted into the Union Army. They weren't drafted in because of the racism of the day, and yet poor whites in New York said, wait, but why are we fighting for them if they're not fighting for themselves? All this is in 1862, especially moving in 1863, when in the North it became a moral cause about ending the scourge of slavery. And Frances Gage says, well, that's not what people expect of a slave. So she gave her a slave talk, uneducated, Southern dialect. It's not true. It's not accurate. But for how many of you in your textbooks, it's version 1. This is not new. I did not just unearth this. This has nothing to do with my work. We've known this for a very long time. This is just absolutely standard in historiography. We published version 1 because it's just better. But therein lies the rub, doesn't it? This is the issue of historical memory. What we're saying is, no, that didn't really happen, but isn't it better than the truth?
Well, it solidifies a whole lot of confirmation bias that is very comfortable for a lot of people.
That's right. It is, right, and it's still, this is the thing, it's not just in the mid-19th, it still rings true. This sounds like something a slave woman would have said. But that's because we have like this idea of a slave woman, not this slave woman. She was in New York, she was bilingual, she was self-educated and more brilliant than most of the people around. But it's still that's not emotive, right? It doesn't fit, it's not what we expect. And so we give what is expected. But that may be in itself the problem, because that then continues to perpetuate these grand, simple narratives. But what I said at the beginning, the issue that comes up that usually I leave students with, and we continue to work this semester, the question that should be lingering is, Why does that ring true? Right? We use stories of the past to give meaning to the present. This is a false story. We know it is, but we still repeat it, which means it does something. It works. So why? How? How is it that we've created historical memory that we know is false and yet it doesn't matter? Because it's better. But what's better? What does that say about our perpetual understanding of women, Black Americans, slavery? It just rings true. It's not history, it's historical memory. But that's also how our world works. It's what we do as humans. No story is the story, it's a story, and it's our story if it works for us. So why is it this story works so well in America? Well, we know it's not true. Now, very briefly, we only have a few more minutes, and then we're going to go eat. Right? I want to mention, so the ways I do this before, and I'll try to put these up for you. We'll have a site where you can download. You have these. I'll give you digital copies. Do whatever you want with anything. Other ways that I taught this of going through of historical memory, the way this gets complicated. Stanford Education Group has a pretty good, I change everything, but some models where they do of historical memory where they take pictures, right? You have background. One thing they do is the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. Right? So not was that moral right? I think that's a problematic lesson and that we're not ethicists and that's an ethical lesson. But of decision making, of understanding the way they do it, there's a bunch of documents that let you understand the general Japanese perspective, right, of Hiroshima's victimization. And then the general American understanding of Hiroshima as victory, right, of celebration. And the question is not which one is right, but can we understand that both of those are valid? They're both different perceptions of the same event based in fact. And then the assignment becomes there's a bunch of pictures. And the question that's given to students is, imagine you're working for the UN and what I assume is an unpaid internship. I always throw that one in there, right? And you're going to create the opening of a web page for that's going to explain, that's going to deal with the dropping of the atomic bombs. Which picture is going to be in the opening of the web page, and you need to give it a caption. I include in these, I've changed the ones they have, but Stanford has it. It's just a mushroom cloud. There's one of kind of the destruction of Hiroshima City afterwards. One is one of those iconic pictures of Pearl Harbor. There's some other ones that would be revenge of the Bataan Death March, right, of some others that come through here. What inevitably happens in the class, the way it comes, is students almost always come back with the mushroom cloud or this innocuous destruction of Hiroshima City. In which, well, I say, why, right? Why'd you pick this? What are you going through? The answer is always, well, we want to be more neutral. We don't want to offend anyone. And then that conversation comes because I've already asked them, they adamantly believe this is something, well, why are you creating the website? What is this? So that it'll never happen again. But if you say your intent, your motive is to make sure this never happens again, why do you keep pitching the neutral ones? Because they think that's the way things, right? And then this has this conversation. Why is it that neutrality is the thing? We take it based on fact. We're entitled to our own opinion, but not our own fact and not our own reality. We have to supply it with evidence. That's what historians do. But every story is a story, right? So how do we remember? The last one real quick I like to do, and I can put this on, is I give two speeches, one by Martin Luther King and one by Malcolm X, except they're both speeches that come from near the end of their lives. Malcolm's is excerpt from Bowed in the Bullet. I can't remember which one King's is, but it comes to, they read these, they go through, and I ask them, okay, which one's the way we did? Which one do you think is Malcolm? Which do you think is Martin? And they go through. What inevitably happens is it's usually the opposite, at least of what half of them think, because we have this understanding. We start a civil rights movement where we have Martin and we have Malcolm, and they're like opposing things. And apparently every Black American in the country picked one or the other. And Malcolm was violent, and Martin was nonviolent, except that doesn't understand, right, as they developed and grew and understand when MLK said, man, I've been naive. De facto racism in the North is maybe worse than de jure in the South. And the last sermon he was working on before he was killed was Why America May Be Damned, as he came out against the Vietnam War and said militarization is intimately tied with capitalism, which is undergirded by racism. Malcolm went on the Hajj and said, oh, there is something where all peoples come together. People can get along. And he said that must be through Islam and not through Christianity. But he, right, famously told Mrs. King, you tell them they can take your husband or they can take me, and I'll be that. So they'll take him. Right? It's complicating the simplified story, because that simplified story is useful. You can have Malcolm, but no, that's bad. But then we have Martin, what I call every white man's favorite black man. Because he doesn't threaten me, at least not the one that I know, when he went to somehow cryogenic sleep in between 65 and 68. Well, if you read what he said between 65 and 68, that becomes more complicated, right? So historical memory matters as we go through.